Welcome. My name is Sarojini Nada, and I serve as the director of the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice at the University of the Western Cape. On behalf of the Desmond Tutu Center, it is my absolute delight to welcome all of you, but especially our guests from out of town, to Cape Town, to St. George's Cathedral, and to this second annual Desmond Tutu Memorial Lecture. So the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice are your hosts tonight, but we are not hosting alone. This lecture is a three-way partnership together with the United Society Partners in the Gospel, USPG, based in London, and York Minster, the Cathedral in York. We have committed to this annual journey of critical reflection on the intersections between religion and social justice. We are so proud to be co-hosts of this lecture because Archbishop Desmond Tutu's voice remains with us, reminding us in that unmistakable way that only he could, that religion is never meant to legitimize injustice, but to dismantle it. So this annual lecture series is about creating a space each year where we pause, reflect, and allow ourselves to be unsettled by questions of injustice in the world. Last year, we gathered under the Gothic arches of York Minster, where we were incredibly blessed to hear Archbishop Tutu's daughter, the Reverend Canon Nontombi Tutu. And honestly, apart from the lecture being poignant and deeply moving, it was slightly disconcerting. This is because she looks so much like him, she sounds so much like him, that at times we had to check ourselves. Is this Nontombi, or has the Arch made a surprise return? But here we are this year, and what an absolute joy it is to welcome the Right Reverend Dr. Vicentia Kgabe, Bishop of Lesotho, to reflect with us on the entanglements of theology, law, land, and justice. We had agreed when we first conceived this lecture that when we invite our speakers, that we would not prescribe topics, that we would ask them to choose the theme that presses on their soul, so to speak, within the broad parameters of religion and social justice, of course. Bishop Vicentia chose the topic of land. She's not one to avoid controversy, as you can imagine. Could there be a more relevant topic in this moment, in this current moment? We know all too well in South Africa that land is not only about property and title deeds, even though some people would like us to believe that, but it is about identity, it's about dignity, it is about survival. And in Palestine, for the past 75 years of brutal occupation and apartheid, land has been contested in blood and tears. And so when Bishop Vicentia told me what she was choosing as her topic, I teased her and said, your lecture could actually just be one line. You could just stand up, look at us and say, we will give the land back, and then sit down. But of course, I'm sure she has much more to say than that. And so I think we're all very eager to listen to you tonight, Bishop Vicentia. And I don't know if she plans to use the story in her lecture, so I hope I'm not stealing it from her. But it's one of those well-traveled jokes that people often attribute to Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And it goes like this. When the white missionaries first came, they had the Bible and we had the land. They told us to close our eyes and pray. And when we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible. It's a joke, yes, but it's also a truth that still haunts our histories of dispossession in this country. But before we hear from her, and I know we're all eager to hear from her, we have a few formalities. I think it's important to ground ourselves properly in this space. This cathedral is known as the People's Cathedral because it stood as a witness against apartheid's cruelties. So tonight, as we gather here in this very space where our beloved Archbishop Tutu was laid to rest, we remember that justice, like faith, is embodied. And it's embodied in land, it's embodied in people, in stories. Indeed, it is embodied in this cathedral. And so to root us here, I would like to invite the Dean of this cathedral, the very Reverend Terry Lester, to light a candle and to ground us in the space. Dean Lester.
Tomorrow morning at 7:15, we shall be saying the Mass in St. John Chapel to my right. And if you are serious about honoring Desmond Tutu, you'll be there. Because he was here Friday after Friday, the 7:15 Mass, leading it. The Eucharist and this place were very central to Desmond's life. He didn't start speaking about justice when he was associated with it as the Archbishop of Cape Town. The issue of justice was a part of in the marrow of his bones, wherever he found himself, whether it was in a parish in Surrey of Bletchingley, or whether it was here, or whether it was at St. Mary's Cathedral in the heart of the CBD of Johannesburg. That was him. And the place from which that came was a very deep understanding and a seeking of the mind of God as to what God is saying, not only to the church, but to people who claim to have religion and spirituality in the day and time in which we live. And how we miss that voice, and how we long to hear it in a time when our world is beset with issues which we thought we had long dealt with, moved on from, and been able to not only embrace, but make a part of our daily breathing and living. And it seems as though we have to keep returning to that wellspring in the wilderness, which the world can often feel like being in, that we can often feel like being in the world, to return to that place, which is the living water, for us to be able to make a significant contribution and response to where we find ourselves as humanity at this time. So I think that this lecture is timeless. I think it invokes the spirit, the deeds, and the person of someone who we hold in highly esteemed. It is a particular privilege for myself that for 39 years of my ordained life, Desmond was very present in my life. First, as Archbishop, elected in 1986, when I was a young priest, and just when I was being ordained priest, I'd been ordained deacon under Philip, his predecessor, and he has been a part of my present in my ministry for 39 years, for all those years, and I feel particularly honored to have been blessed in that way. It is also a particular honor to welcome my counterpart in York and to visit and to welcome the Bishop of Lesotho, and those of you who are here, Professor Christo, who is here, who started out this lecture at the Center for Desmond at UWC. Welcome, wonderful to have you. May God bless us, not only with Desmond's spirit, but with his vigor, but more importantly also with his humor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dean Lester. And for reminding us of where we come from. So now we travel northward in spirit, if not in body, to York, As I mentioned, it was at York Minster that this lecture series was born, and last year we were graciously hosted there. And so tonight we are honored to welcome the Dean of York Minster himself, the Very Reverend Dominic Barrington. Dean Dominic, we invite you to offer us a few opening remarks. Thank you. Welcome.
Sisters and brothers, it is a joy and a privilege to be here. I've not set foot in this cathedral before, but what it has stood for has been an important part of the life of the world and certainly the life of the Anglican Communion. I bring you greetings from Archbishop Stephen, the Archbishop of York, and kind of currently the Archbishop of the Church of England. I invite your prayers, especially if you are an Anglican, for those who I think are meeting any day now to make the final selection of a new Archbishop of Canterbury. Desmond Tutu's voice was a voice that spoke to the world, and the fact that that voice does not live on in him anymore just makes the rest of us all the more responsible for making sure that the values which he espoused with such clarity and such charisma continue to be heard. Across the world, we look in so many ways in horror at the way the world is turning. I don't think that the United Kingdom is entirely exempt from that. And lighting a candle that reminds the world of the link between the good news of Jesus Christ and what we call social justice, which I don't think is a term Jesus would have ever thought of using. There was just justice, I think, for Jesus, and making sure that that voice is internalized by everyone and externalized by as many as possible is in part, I think, what tonight is about. So it is an enormous privilege for York to be connected to this lecture series, and I bring you, therefore, prayers and greetings from one metropolitical cathedral church that is the seat of an archbishop to another here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Barrington. So we are also very fortunate to have with us the Right Reverend David Walker, Bishop of Manchester and Chair of the USPG Board of Trustees. And Bishop Walker is also going to say a few words of welcome. Thank you, Bishop Walker.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege for me to be here. I couldn't get to the one in York Minster last year, so I thought, well, I was going to be around the corner from here this summer, so I would make the effort to come this time round. We're linked with the Diocese of Namibia in Manchester, and so I've been up in Namibia until a couple of weeks ago. But yes, I've been chair of USPG for just over a year now. I've known of the organisation and been a great admirer of it for many years. USPG 20 years ago, when I was a much younger bishop, supported me to spend some time in the Anglican Diocese of Peru, where I learnt that the bishop there had a simple policy. The church was growing, but he said you can be a congregation, you can worship God with all the enthusiasm in the world, but until you are doing some work for social justice in your community, you can't be a parish. And I sometimes wish that rule applied in England as well. I think I might have fewer parishes than the 250 something I've got at the moment if they all had to be doing some work of social justice. Though many of them are. But for me, the Christian response begins with the pastoral, but inevitably then ends up in the political. And I think nobody put it better than Archbishop Tutu himself when he said something along the lines of, when I fished enough bodies out of the river, I take in a little walk upstream and see who's throwing them in. And I think that's when you begin to, not just dealing with the impact of injustice in the world, but when you start tackling the causes. And that's when it gets challenging. That's when you get criticised. That's when you can find that you lose your liberty in some parts of the world. So I have long admired Archbishop Tutu for helping me to make that link, not just with the pastoral concern for those immediately around me, but what is the situation, what are the structures, the societal structures that leave people oppressed in the way that so many of them are. It's a great privilege for me to be chair of USPG. We are strong supporters of the Al-Hali hospital in Gaza, which has been attacked several times in recent months by the Israeli Defense Forces. We're working with them to try to keep the hospital open there as a witness that even in the most horrific of places, the most dreadful of situations, the love of God can still be expressed. So I'm very much looking forward. I'm not going to say any more about USPG because I'm going to be followed quite soon by a colleague who works full time there. But I'm just a part-timer who swans around the world and enjoys the fun without having to do too much of the hard work. But so I'll leave the rest to my colleague. But thank you. It's a great privilege to be here tonight.
Thank you so much, Bishop David Walker. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce someone I have known, I think, for almost 20 years. We're showing our age, Peniel, from his time when he worked as program executive for interreligious dialogue and cooperation in the World Council of Churches. Peniel is not only a colleague and a friend, but also one of the most insightful theologians I know. He currently serves as the Director of Global Mission at USPG, and I'm very pleased that he is the key person who began this partnership with us. And so I'm delighted this evening, to welcome Peniel Rajkumar to introduce our speaker tonight. Peniel. Okay.
Thank you, Sarojini. Dear friends, it is an honor for me to introduce Bishop Right Reverend Dr. Vicentia Kgabe, who is the speaker this evening. I'm sure that she needs no introduction. When we thought of the Desmond Tutu, but still I'm going to introduce her. When we thought of the Desmond Tutu Memorial Lecture, what we were trying to do was to bring together two priorities of USPG's work, which is to rethink mission and champion justice. And when we were thinking of who might be the speaker for the Desmond Tutu Memorial Lecture this year, the first name that came up was Bishop Vicentia's name. And we are really delighted that she accepted our invitation to deliver this evening's lecture. As all of you might know, Bishop Vicentia is a distinguished South African theologian, educator, and Anglican bishop who is currently serving as the diocesan bishop of the Anglican Church in Lesotho, with which USPG has got long-standing ties. With over 2 decades of experience in pastoral ministry, theological education, and institutional leadership, what Bishop Vicentia brings is a deep commitment to the Church's transformative mission, not just in Africa, but also beyond. Bishop Vicentia, or Bishop Winnie as she is known to many of us here, holds a PhD in practical theology from the University of Pretoria, where she also completed her BA honors and MA degrees. And her academic journey includes advanced leadership studies at the Gordon Institute of Business Science and a postgraduate diploma in enterprise management from Rhodes University Business School. And most recently, as evidence of her quest for learning, she earned an LLM in canon law from the University of Cardiff and has been awarded an honorary degree by Berkeley Divinity School at Yale. And before her episcopal appointment in 2021, Bishop Vicentia served as rector and principal of the College of the Transfiguration in Grahamstown, another institution with which USPG has got strong ties. And this is the only provincial theological college in the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. She has also held various pastoral and leadership roles, and as an accomplished academic, she's also contributed to numerous theological publications. Beyond her church roles, Bishop Vicentia is also engaged in transformation in the wider community, and she has served as both board member and chair of Hope Africa, as well as the vice chair of the Rhodes University Council. And currently, she serves as chairperson of the Center for Anglican Women's Research and Leadership in Africa. Throughout her life and her work, Bishop Winnie has demonstrated a deep commitment to leadership development, reconciliation, gender justice, and youth empowerment, both within the church and in the society. And we are really honored that you are here with us to deliver this lecture. Let us welcome Bishop Vicentia Kgabe.
Thank you. And every Anglican in South Africa has to step a foot here. So I'm grateful to be in this space. So distinguished colleagues, beloved in Christ and honored guests, it is both a privilege and a responsibility to stand before you today to deliver this keynote. My reflection arises from my research on the impact of South African Land Reform Act of 1996 on land consecrated by the Anglican Church. But beyond the academic framing, this subject is deeply personal because land is never a legal concept. It is about identity, belonging, dignity, and faith. In South Africa, land has always been more than soil under our feet. It is the ground of our stories, the cradle of our communities, and the vessel of our memories. To lose land is to lose not only livelihood, but also identity and continuity with one's ancestors. As the writer Atkinson once said, he said, "Land is a story place. Land holds the stories of human survival across generations. Land shapes people just as people shape their countries," close quote. Our history tells of dispossession and dislocation, of laws that stripped communities of their birthright, from the Glen Grey Act of 1894 to the 1913 Native Land Act and the decades of forced removals that followed. Land was wrenched from the hands of many South Africans and concentrated in the possession of the few. These laws did not simply reorganize geography, they dislocated identity, fractured families, and condemned generations to poverty. The church cannot escape this story. Indeed, the Anglican Church, along with other missionary denominations, was woven into the fabric of colonial settlement. Mission land was often granted by colonial authorities or occasionally by African chiefs for the use in evangelization, education, and healthcare. These lands became centers of education and refuge, but they were also entangled in systems of power that dispossessed others. Thus, the church became both a bearer of good news and at times a beneficiary of injustice. It is this paradox that animates my research and this address. How do we as church and society grapple with a legacy of consecrated land, land set apart for God's use, in the face of state-led land reform, when the state says, this land must be redistributed for justice. And the church says, this land has been consecrated for God. What then? In the 1996 Constitution of the Republic of South Africa promised transformation. Its Land Clause, Section 25, established right to restitution of those dispossessed, redistribution of the excluded, and tenure reform for those rendered insecure. The Land Reform Act of 1996 emerged as a legal instrument to redress centuries of injustice. Yet, the story of its implementation has been one of both aspiration and frustration, progress and delay. My task today is to trace this intersection between law and liturgy, between civil land reform and ecclesiastical consecration. I will ask, what has been the impact of the Land Reform Act on the land held by the Anglican Church of Southern Africa? How does the theology of consecration, the setting apart of land for God, interact with the state policies of redistribution? And perhaps most importantly, what is the prophetic responsibility of the church in a land still scarred by dispossession? This is not merely a South African question. Across the globe, faith communities hold vast amounts of land. The challenge of how that land is stewarded, how it is used for mission, and how it relates to broader struggles for injustice is an ecumenical, indeed international concern. In what follows, I will move through three key movements. First, the history of land dispossession and the legal framework of the Land Reform Act. Second, the theological and canonical understanding of consecration. And third, the Anglican Church's own attempts through its land summits and policies to respond to this challenge. Along the way, I will draw out lessons and questions that remain for us today. Friends, land is never neutral. For Israel in the Bible, the land was a covenantal gift from God to be shared, to be justly held, and to be protected. For South Africa, land is constitutional, the site of redress, of equity, of restitution. For the church, the land is sacramental, consecrated, and set apart, a sign of God's dwelling amongst God's people. And so the intersection of land, law, and liturgy is not merely academic. It goes to the heart of justice, of identity, and of the gospel itself. Let us then begin with a historical story. For to understand the present, we must first reckon with the past. When we speak of land in South Africa, we enter a story layered with pain, law, resistance, and survival. The dispossession of land was not a single event, but a long, deliberate process engineered through legislation, violence, and the complicity of institutions, including at times the church. The Glen Grey Act of 1894, others might say this is the official legislation of land dispossession. This act, introduced under the leadership of Cecil John Rhodes, was one of the earliest formal instruments of dispossession. It sought to dismantle communal landholding among the Xhosa people in the Eastern Cape, replacing it with individual tenure. However, the hidden purpose was to compel African men into wage labor by taxing them and restricting their ability to sustain themselves on their land. In effect, the act severed families from their ancestral practices of land stewardship and drew them into colonial economy on exploitative terms. Then came the Native Land Act of 1913, perhaps the most infamous of them all. This act prohibited black South Africans from owning land in the 93% of the country, confining them to a mere 7%, later extended to 13.5% under the 1936 Land Trust Act. As Saul Plaatje wrote in his searing account, The Native Life in South Africa, he writes, awakening on Friday morning, June 20th, 1913, the South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth, close quote. The 1913 Act did not simply redraw maps. It stripped African farmers of the right to buy or to lease land, reduced many to tenant laborers, and entrenched the cycle of poverty and dependence. It also fractured identity. As Mosoma has argued, the dislocation of Africans from their land made them doubt their standing as full human, close quote. To lose land was not just an economic blow, it was an existential wound. The apartheid state, building on this earlier loss, deepened dispossession through the Group Areas Act and the creation of so-called homelands or Bantustans. Millions were forcibly removed from their homes and communities, often dumped on barren land far from economic opportunity. These forced removals continue to be felt to this day in the spatial inequalities of South African cities and the underdevelopment of rural communities. So in all of this, where was the church? The answer is complex. The Anglican Church, similar to other missionary churches, arrived in South Africa in the 1800s, led by Bishop Robert Gray. Land for mission stations, as I alluded earlier, was often provided by colonial authorities or sometimes by African chiefs who believed that the church would offer education, healthcare, and opportunities. These stations usually encompassed schools, hospitals, and farms, serving as centers of learning and refuge in many instances. Yet, we must be honest. This mission lens also implicated the church in the colonial project. Land grants sometimes displaced local communities. The very presence of the mission land created an image of the church as aligned with imperial structures. The High Commissioner of the Cape once introduced Bishop Gray to a local chief as Bishop Gray as the great chief of teachers who has come to teach you the Queen's religion, close quote. That moment captured the intertwining of colonial power and Christian mission. By the late 19th and early 20th century, the Anglican Church had become a significant landowner. Across South Africa, dioceses held farms, schools, parsonages, and vast mission stations. Some of this land was well stewarded, serving the communities, but some was leased to white farmers, entrenching racialized patterns of ownership. The Roman Catholic Church, Moravians, Lutherans, and Methodists held similar extensive tracts of land. This raises a painful paradox. The church, which proclaims liberation in Christ, sometimes became custodians of land acquired through systems of injustice. At the same time, many missionaries did resist colonial oppression, advocated for African rights, and defended communities against abuse. The record is mixed, but the fact remains that the church entered the democratic era as a substantial landholder, with both a spiritual and moral responsibility for how that land is used. For Africans, land is more than property. It is communal, ancestral, and spiritual. To lose land is to lose one's place in the cosmos. This resonates deeply with the biblical witness. The Hebrew scriptures are saturated with the theme of land, the promise of Abraham, the exodus to the land of Canaan, the laws of Jubilee, and the laments of exile. Land is a covenantal gift of God to be shared equitably, never to be hoarded by the few. The psalmist declares, "The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it." Matthew's Gospel tells us, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Theologians like Wright and Rassane remind us that land symbolizes God's blessing, security, and dignity for God's people. Chimamanda describes land as communal, spiritual, sacramental, healing, and eschatological. In other words, land is not just real estate. It is locus of divine human encounter. Here then lies the tension. By the dawn of democracy in 1994, the Anglican Church and other denominations were in possession of land that was both consecrated, set apart for God, and contested, implicated in histories of dispossession. The question facing us was, what will become of this land under a democratic state committed to restitution, redistribution, and reform? Could consecrated land also become land for justice? Could the Church's canonical commitment to sacred spaces coexist with the state's constitutional obligation to redress? This tension sets the stage for the Land Reform Act of 1996, which attempted to chart a path forward towards restitution and equity. And it's to that act and its impact on both society and the Church that we now turn. With the birth of democracy came the promise of new dispensation. The apartheid system was not only denied political rights, but also entrenched vast inequalities in land ownership. At that moment, the new South Africa faced a fundamental question: how could a nation so profoundly scarred by dispossession be rebuilt on the foundation of justice? The answer lay in part in the 1996 Constitution, Section 25, often called the Property Clause, recognizes the property right, but within a framework of redress. It does not treat property as an absolute right. Instead, it balances it against the imperative of transformation. The Constitution guarantees that, 1, people dispossessed after 19th June 1913 by racially discriminatory laws have a right to restitution to their property or equitable redress. 2, people whose tenure of land is insecure due to past discrimination have the right to secure tenure or comparable redress. 3, the state may expropriate land in the public interest, subject to just and equitable compensation. This was a remarkable shift. Unlike many other constitutions, South Africa's did not simply entrench private property, it embedded transformation and justice into the very definition of ownership. The Land Reform Act of 1996 operationalized these constitutional commitments through 3 pillars: restitution, returning land or offering compensation to individuals and communities, those dispossessed after 1913, redistribution, which means transferring white-owned commercial farm to Black South Africans. The original goal was to redistribute 30% of such land by 2014. Tenure reform, securing the right of labor tenants, farm dwellers, and peoples living in the former homelands. This was not just about farming. It was about dignity, about reconnecting people to the land from which they had been torn. To implement this, the state created Commission on Restitution of Land Rights and the Land Claims Court. These bodies were meant to provide accessible, just, and speedy remedies. Claims were submitted to not directly to landowners, but to the state, which acted as mediator. If mediation failed, the courts could intervene. Yet, as is often the case, the ideals of law collided with the realities of administration. This whole process faced challenges in its implementation. One, the volumes of claims by 1998 deadline, we read that 80,000 claims were lodged. Resolving them proved to be slow and cumbersome. To compensation over land, many urban claims were settled with financial compensation rather than restitution of land, leaving the underlying patterns of ownership largely unchanged. 3, groups versus individual ownership. Redistribution of land places land in the hands of communal property association, which sometimes lack the resources or governance structures to manage it sustainably. 4, there were delays. Some claims lingered for decades without resolution, eroding trust in the system. 5th, exclusion. Missionary and church land was often left outside the scope of redistribution, raising difficult questions about the place of ecclesiastical property in the land reform. Considering the case of Dudley v. Minister of Rural Development and Land Reform 2021, here a family had lodged a restitution claim as far back as 1996. After being dispossessed under the Group Areas Act, the Commission investigated but only finalized its report in 2019, 23 years later. By then, the original claimant had passed away. The family was offered compensation of 131,640, which they rejected as inadequate. The case went to the Land Claims Court, which criticized the Commission for its delay and for failing to adequately inform the family of their rights. This case illustrates the human cost of bureaucratic inefficiency. Behind every claim lies a story of dispossession, of attachment to land, of longing for justice. When delays stretch into decades, the very purpose of restitution is undermined. In recent years, frustration with the slow pace of reform has fueled debates about whether land should be expropriated without compensation. Some see this as the only way to achieve justice. Others fear it threatens investment, stability, and constitutional integrity. The debate remains unresolved, underscoring the central role land plays in South Africa's identity and future. For the churches, the Land Reform Act raised searching questions. The Anglican Church of Southern Africa, along with the Roman Catholic Church, the Methodist Church, and the Lutheran Church, and some African independent churches, all hold significant land. Some of this land was given through other means. Much of it has been consecrated, meaning it now belongs to God. Part of it is being consecrated for burial, for mission, and for worship. The act did not specifically target church land, yet the moral question lingered. Should churches voluntarily offer land for redistribution? Should consecrated land be beyond reach or reform? What does it mean for a church that preaches justice to own land acquired through systems of injustice? These are not easy questions. On one hand, consecrated land is set apart for God's service. On the other hand, God is the God of justice, who proclaims through the prophets, woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is room for no one but you. That's Isaiah 5:8. It is precisely this tension between liturgy and law, between sacred consecration and public justice, that lies at the heart of this paper. And it's this tension that drove the Anglican Church in 2002 and again in 2004 to convene Land Summit to reflect on how to steward its land in light of new democratic dispensation. In a moment, we will turn to those summits and their outcomes. However, before we proceed, let us pause to consider the theological dimension. For consecration is not just a ritual act. It is a declaration that land belongs to God. And if land belongs to God, then surely it must be used in ways that advances God's justice. To understand the complexity of church land in the era of reform, we must step aside in a world of theology and canon law. While the state views land primarily as legal and in economic terms, the church views certain land in sacramental terms as consecrated and set apart for God. The practice of consecrating land and building has deep biblical roots. In Chronicles, 2 Chronicles chapter 7, we read how after Solomon prayed, fire fell from heaven and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The people bowed down, worshipped, and dedicated the house of God. The act of consecration marked that place as holy, a dwelling of God among God's people. For the Anglican tradition, consecration is more than a formality. It is a declaration that a piece of land, whether a church building, graveyard, or a mission space, has been permanently dedicated to divine use. Once consecrated, such space or land is not to be used for profane purpose. It becomes, in the words of canon law, sacred in perpetuity. This theology reflects profound truth that land is not ultimately ours. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, sings the psalmist. By consecrating land, the church acknowledges that reality. But it also raises a question. If land belongs to God and God is God of justice, can consecration ever be used as a shield against redistribution? Canon law across the Anglican Communion upholds the practice of consecration. The principles of canon law common to the churches of the Anglican Communion states that buildings and churchyards may be set aside for God through consecration or dedication. Consecration is customarily performed by a bishop. Consecrated property may not be used for purposes inconsistent with its sacred character. A bishop may revoke consecration if church no longer requires the land. In the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, Canon 31 stipulates that no consecrated ground of building may be sold, exchanged, or dispossessed of without authorization of the diocesan synod. When such a disposal occurs, the bishop issues a revocation of consecration, which must be read publicly and kept in diocesan records. Thus, from a canonical perspective, consecrated land carries a particular status. It is not only simply a real estate, it is part of the church's patrimony entrusted for sacred purpose. In civil law, however, consecration does not automatically change ownership. If a diocese holds title to a property, it remains the owner under South African law, regardless of whether the land is consecrated or not. The state recognizes the ecclesiastical act, but it does not treat it as creating a separate legal category. This means that consecrated land though sacred in canon law, it is not immune from expropriation under the Constitution. The state could, in principle, expropriate church land for public purposes, provided compensation is just and equitable. Yet, in practice, consecration complicates matters. A government may hesitate to seize land that holds deep religious significance. Communities may resist repurposing land that has been used for worship or burial. The symbolic weight of consecration is immense, even if its legal weight is limited. The Land Reform Act demands redistribution in the name of justice. Canon law requires that consecrated land be preserved for God's purpose. What happens then when these demands collide? Some argue that consecration should be absolute. Once land is given to God, is God's. Others argue that God's justice requires to hold consecration lightly, willing to release even sacred land if doing so serves the poor and restores dignity to the dispossessed. Freedom of Religion South Africa, a legal advocate group, has expressed concern that land reform could threaten religious freedom if churches are compelled. Then our theology of consecration needs re-examining. It is worth noting that across the Anglican Communion, the rules of consecration vary, but the principles are shared. And I won't take you through all the dioceses and provinces, what they do. So how could we in Southern Africa understand consecration in light of land reform? Perhaps the answer lies in reimagining consecration itself. To consecrate land is to declare that it belongs to God, but God's mission is not confined to altars and sanctuaries. It is also about feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, and empowering the landless. Consecrated land, then, should not be frozen in sacred use for the few, but it should be mobilized for the flourishing of the many. A church that owns fertile fields cannot claim consecration as reason to withhold them from the hungry. A church that possesses empty land in a township cannot cite canon law to deny its use for housing or clinics. To do so will be to betray the very God in whose name that land was consecrated. As the prophet Micah reminds us, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Consecration and land reform need not to be enemies. If rightly understood, they can be allies, both proclaiming that land is not merely commodity, it is a covenant. It is not only property, it is also promise. And it must be stewarded for the good of all God's children. The Anglican Church of Southern Africa could not remain silent in the face of South Africa's new land dispensation. The Land Reform Act of 1996 raised a profound challenge as one of the significant non-state landholders in the region. How should the church steward its land in the ways consistent with both gospel and the Constitution? In 1999, the Provincial Synod that met in Bloemfontein mandated Bishop Ruben Philip, retired. At that time, he was the licensed bishop on land issues, to lead a process of reflection. Out of this resolution came the 2002 Provincial Land Summit, held for dioceses within South Africa. The aims were clear. One, to establish an inventory of land owned by each diocese. Two, to assess how church land was being used. Thirdly, to develop strategies for ensuring that land contributes to social transformation. Delegates to the summit included bishops, clergy, and lay people with expertise in land issues. The Church Land Program, an ecumenical NGO based in Pietermaritzburg, helped to facilitate the process. The methodology was grounded in theological reflection of seeing, judge, and act. See, judge, act. See the realities, understanding the social, political, and historical context of land in each diocese. Judging was to analyze these realities in the light of scripture, tradition, and church prophetic role. Acting was to develop diocesan strategies for stewardship, redistribution, and advocacy. 2 years later, a second summit was convened. This time included dioceses outside of South Africa, such as Lesotho, Namibia, Swaziland, Angola, and Mozambique. South Africa's Land Reform Act did not legally bind these dioceses, but the Anglican province sought to maintain a common policy across Southern Africa. In his open remarks, Bishop Philip emphasized that land reform was not merely a South Africa issue, but a regional one. Across the continent, colonial legacies had left vast tracts of arable land in the hands of a few, while millions remained landless or confined to degraded land. Zimbabwe's fast-track land redistribution program, with all its controversies, underscored the urgency of the matter. He framed the church's task in biblical terms to ensure that its own land holdings contributed to sustainable livelihoods, especially for women and the poor, and to raise a prophetic voice in the public debates on land. 2 summits produced a series of important recommendations aimed at aligning church landholding with gospel justice. There were many recommendations, as good Anglicans do, and they still remain recommendations. Underlying these recommendations was a conviction that the church must reclaim its prophetic role. The Rustenburg Declaration of 1990 had already insisted that justice in land matters was a gospel imperative. The summits restated this, reminding Anglicans that God's vision of shalom, well-being, justice, and peace demands equitable access to land. To quote from the summit deliberations, they say, then we were called CPSA, must seek ways to develop its land to enhance sustainable livelihoods for communities and continue to advocate on behalf of the poor and the marginalized, especially women in our dioceses, to see land equitably distributed and developed as a sign of the coming reign of God, close quote. But noble resolutions are one thing. Sustained implementation is another. Nearly 2 decades later, questions still remain. 1, did dioceses complete their land audits as they were asked? Some did, but many struggle with incomplete records, conflicting claims, and lack of resources. The question still is out there, has the church distributed land? There are examples of parishes leasing land to communities or using church farms for development projects, but the overall picture is patchy. Has a coherent provincial policy emerged? Some progress has been made, but not all recommendations were institutionalized. Are women truly benefiting? Gender equality remains a challenge. A patriarchal attitude and structural barriers persist in both the church and society. One of the summit's implicit silence was around consecration. The opening address did not engage directly with how land had been consecrated, nor with the theological implications of repurposing consecrated land. It was as though consecration was assumed and left unexplored. The silence points to an ongoing theological task to reconcile consecration with redistribution so that setting land apart for God does not become a barrier for setting land apart for justice. In sum, as we summarize this, the Anglican Church response has been a mixture of courage and caution, vision and hesitation. The very act of convening Land Summit was bold. Few churches worldwide have so directly interrogated their own land holding. The emphasis on poverty eradication, gender justice, and prophetic witness remains vital. Yet gaps in follow-through reminds us that institutional lethargy is a powerful force. Land is not only theological and legal, it is also emotional, financial, and political. For a church, to part with land is to part with security. But to cling too tightly is to betray the gospel. The lesson is clear. The church cannot simply be custodian of consecrated land. It must be an agent of land justice. If our land serves only our own maintenance, then consecration has become idolatry. But if our land serves the poor, empowers the landless, and embodies reconciliation, then consecration has become prophecy. While this paper is focused primarily on the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, it is vital to recognize that it is not only an Anglican issue alone. The question of land, consecration, and reform are shared across denomination and indeed across the entire South African society. The Church Land Program, CLP, based in Pietermaritzburg, worked with ecumenically to support landless people movements, to challenge unjust policies, and to hold churches accountable for their land stewardship. And this is where CLP became a key partner for Anglicans, Methodists, and Roman Catholics alike. This collaboration reminds us that no single denomination can resolve the land question adequately. Land reform is a national issue, and the witness of the churches is strong when it is united. Beyond the churches, South Africa's society has been marked by ongoing contestation over land. Urban land hunger remains acute as informal settlements expand. The cities struggle to provide adequate housing. Rural land reform has been slow and uneven, with many projects failing due to lack of support and corruption. The inequality of ownership remains stuck, where the minority population continue to own the majority of commercial land. The frustration of the landless is palpable. Movements like Abahlali Basemjondolo and Landless People's Movement have emerged to demand agent reform. Their protests are often met with resistance and sometimes with violence. Yet their cry echoes the biblical lament, "How long, O Lord, how long?" In this context, the church is called to play a prophetic role. The church is uniquely placed to mediate between state and society, to advocate for the landless, and to model alternative practice of stewardship. The prophetic voice is not simply about issuing statements, it is about living differently. A church that opens its land for housing the homeless is making a prophetic statement more powerful than any press release. A parish that cultivates its land for food security and shares the harvest with the hungry embodies the gospel more persuasively than any sermon. At the same time, the church must speak truth to power. When the government drags its feet on restitution, the church must hold it accountable. When land reform becomes a tool for political patronage rather than justice, the church must expose it. When violence erupts around land occupation, the church must be present as a peacemaker, but also as an advocate for the poor. The South African experience, therefore, has significance far beyond our borders. It reminds the global church that faith and land are inseparable. To proclaim the gospel without addressing land is to preach an abstract message, detached from people's lives' realities. What we need is a prophetic imagination, the ability to see consecrated land not as an untouchable relic, but as a living gift. To imagine churchyards that also serve as community gardens. To imagine mission stations that become centers of land-based livelihoods. To imagine diocesan land being used to settle restitution claims or to pilot new models of cooperative farming. This is not only possible, it is faithful. For the God who consecrates land is the God who liberates enslaved people, who defends widows and orphans, who commands that every 50th year be a jubilee in which the land is restored to its rightful stewards. As I draw this to a close, allow me to gather the threads of our reflection. We have journeyed from the long shadow of dispensation through the constitutional promise of restitution into the theological mystery of consecration and the practical response of the church. What then can we say, and where must we go from here? First, we have learned that land is never neutral. In South Africa, land has been the site of oppression, of exploitation, of suffering. However, it can also be a site of healing, justice, and renewal. How we steward land tells a story, and the church must ask, what story does our land tell? Second, we have learned that law and liturgy must speak to each other. The Land Reform Act of 1996, with all its shortcomings, represents a constitutional commitment to redress. Canon law, with its theology of consecration, represents a commitment to the sacred. These are not irreconcilable. Indeed, when held together rightly, they point us towards a vision of land that is both holy and just, both set apart and shared. Third, we have learned that church cannot avoid self-examination. Through the 2002 and 2004 land summits, Anglicans in Southern Africa asked courageous questions about their own land holding. Some progress has been made, much remains unfinished. The temptation for any institution is to protect itself, but the gospel calls us to pour ourselves out for others. If the church clings too tightly to the land, it risks betraying the very Christ who had nowhere to lay his head. The challenge continues, and we must be honest with this challenge, that the pace of land reform in South Africa has been painfully slow. Many restitution claims remains unresolved. Decades after the process began, redistribution targets have not been met, inequality of ownership remains stuck, theological work on consecration and justice is still underdeveloped. Too often, consecration is treated as a legal barrier rather than a spiritual call to creative stewardship. Within the church, implementation of the summit recommendation has been uneven. These challenges are not reasons for despair, but they are reminders that the work is far from finished. There's a lot to be done, and we must do it. The church, the state, and the academia. As for us in academia and scholars of law, theology, and history, the task is to keep interrogating, to keep remembering, to keep imagining. Scholarship is not a luxury. It is part of the struggle for justice. By studying the intersection of land, law, and faith, we equip society with the tools to think more deeply and more wisely. Allow me to end with a vision. I imagine a South Africa where land is not a source of division, but of dignity, where restituted communities flourish, where redistributed farms feed the nation, where urban land is made available for housing, where every person knows that they belong. Imagine a church whose consecrated land is a living parable of God's kingdom places of worship, but also hosts feeding schemes, churchyards that doubles as community gardens, and missions that become centers of training and empowerment. Imagine our dioceses, where we say this land is God's, therefore we must serve God's people. Dear friends, this is not utopia, it is the gospel. For our Lord Jesus Christ declared, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because God has anointed us to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, and to let the oppressed go free." The land question is not a pariah to the gospel. It is the very heart of God's mission of justice and reconciliation. To proclaim Christ crucified and risen is also to proclaim that the landless must inherit the land, that the poor must be lifted up, and the earth itself must be healed. And so, as we leave this gathering tonight, let us carry with us the conviction that consecrated land must be consecrated for justice, that the church must be a steward not only of altars, but of fields, that the academia must serve not only the pursuit of knowledge, but the pursuit of equity, and that the state must serve not only legality, but the living realities of its people. The work is great, the obstacles are real, the promise is greater still, for the God who created heaven and earth is also the God who declared, "Behold, I make all things new." Thank you.
Wow. I think that deserves another round of applause. I'm not sure that many people know the story, but there's been a beautiful symbolic handing over directly from Archbishop Tutu himself to Bishop Vinnie. She is following in his footsteps in so many ways. As you know, he too was once Bishop of Lesotho. And in 2021, when Bishop Vicentia was consecrated, Rene and others tell us that the Arch would have loved to be there. But by that time, as you all know, it was the beginning of December, he was gravely ill. What he did instead was to send his daughter Nontombi on behalf of himself and the Tutu family to present to Bishop Vicentia his own set of red vestments, a red cope, a stole, and a mitre, all packaged in a special vestments bag with his own initials stitched into it. And I think that these will pass to you, Vicentia, as a sign of continuity and courage. And that's what you've shown today. And I think the feminists in the room know what red means to us, right? It's the color of blood, of resistance, of defiance, and of life. And that's what he has placed on her shoulders. And I think if he were here today, he would just be beaming, so proud of you, Vicentia. So I think we can all agree that you have done him incredibly proud, and we just want to say thank you. I know that we are in a church. I know that we all can make speeches and sermons. So I'm going to ask you to keep it brief. Don't give the paper you weren't invited to give, as I always say. But we do want to spend just a few minutes on questions, comments. Yeah. Anyone?
How many acres of land is used by private schools, schools like Bishops, Social Income, certainly among the elite, schools that operate on this consecrated land, but also in turn profit, not for the church, but for organized education. That remain inaccessible to the person.
Yeah. Thank you, Rene.
The motions and the things that come out of synod, as we call resolutions, that we need to ask tough and honest questions. If we borrow an institution, the name of the church, and we get nothing out of it, what does that mean? If we have ceremonial priestly persons in those spaces, what does it mean? There is at the back of the canons in the Acts where we have a little form where a school and a diocese have to agree in how they work together and representation, and somehow the board of the school needs to be represented in diocesan synod. Many of our dioceses don't know about that. Many of our dioceses don't do that. So we continue to give away without being good stewards of what God has given us. So it's on us as the church that we don't take care of our properties and what has been entrusted to us. So it's a challenge to us as synods. Let's do the real work there.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? So much silence. Did you all also think that it should have just been one line, give back the land? I think people are just enthralled. So thank you so much. Thank you again, Bishop Vinnie, for those the profound and challenging way in which you brought this to us. But also, I think it is so refreshing to see how your research, your very deep research, is taking shape in the real questions that we have to answer. So thank you so much. Okay, so before we close this evening, I want us to pause for a moment and receive another gift. At the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice, we don't only produce scholarship and research, but we also nurture creativity, art, poetry, dance, interpretive dance, which we're not offering tonight. But because Archbishop Desmond Tutu reminded us that justice without joy is incomplete. And so we want to close off tonight with a poem. And I want to invite Dr. Thandi Gamedze, who's a senior researcher in the Tutu Center and who also is a poet, to share a poem with us. Thandi.
His poem is called Of Home and Wholeness. Hostile city built on stolen land with stolen hands, how dare you label attempts to create sanctuary as illegal? Homemaking is revolutionary in this system born of displacement. Wholeness is revolutionary in this system invested in dislocation. Keep fighting to make home. Keep fighting to be whole. It doesn't seem possible, but perhaps a day will come when home and wholeness are no longer forcibly removed. A day where they shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat of their fruit, that reality of which the prophet Isaiah long since dreamed. But in the meantime, do not forget, your very breath is resistance. Your very presence is protest. In this world telling you your life does not matter, the defiant drumbeat of your heart is bravery. Your very being is courageous. So whatever they say, breathe the air like it was yours. Take up space like it was 1651. If you have the strength, go on and build. And if, when they have done their worst, you still have strength, if you still have breath, build again. Thank you.
Dear brothers and sisters, on behalf of the three institutions which have organized this evening, I want to offer the vote of thanks. I have a long list of people to thank and 5 minutes to do that. So let me begin with Bishop Vicentia. They say that we can only be fully alive in those moments when our hearts are conscious of the gifts that we have received. And today has been a gift in every sense of the word. From Bishop Vicentia, we have received the gift of prophetic wisdom, of a passion that is rooted in God's own compassion, and the gift of the challenge to reimagine consecration. And on behalf of all of us, I want to thank Bishop Vicentia for having both fed our imagination, but also for freeing it in ways that can be aligned with the values of the gospel. Thank you, Bishop Willie. It is appropriate that this lecture should take place in St. George's Cathedral, a cathedral that was at the heart of the ministry and witness of Archbishop Tutu. And we want to thank the Dean, the very Reverend Terry Lester, for making this place available for this lecture today. Thank you, Dean Terry, and for welcoming us to this school. As has been mentioned, this lecture is organized in partnership by 3 different organizations. And I want to thank our host, our local host, Professor Sarojini Nada from the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice, for having invited us to South Africa, to Cape Town, and for taking all the efforts to organize this lecture. Thank you, Professor Nada. We also want to thank the administrator of the center, Ms. Feriel Mali, for all the efforts that you took in ensuring that this lecture took place today. Thank you, Feriel. And to Dr. Thandi Gamedse for that profound poem that grounded us in and rooted us in the spirituality, which is always something that goes hand to hand with the quest for justice. Thank you both. I also want to thank the Dean of York Minster, the very Reverend Dominic Barrington, for the way in which you have accompanied this idea of having this lecture right from the beginning, Dominic, and for having made it a point to be here this evening alongside Canon Maggie McLean, the Canon Missioner of York Minster. It's a joy that we are doing this together. And on behalf of USPG, I want to thank you both for the partnership. And I want to thank our own chairperson, the Right Reverend David Walker, the Chair of Trustees of USPG, for your able guidance as we keep on partnering in the gospel in ways which will make the vision of justice and peace a living reality for communities across the world. And thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening, Bishop David. Thank you. And I want to thank each one of you for making this the occasion that it has been today. Your presence this evening is of much importance and means a lot to us as the organizations which have been involved in organizing this. And I really hope that this evening has been a blessing which is also a challenge. As they say, it is appropriate that we count our blessings, but it is also appropriate that we make our blessings count. And today is one such occasion where the blessing of challenge that we have received from Bishop Vicentia is something that we need to make count as we go out of this place. And I want to thank each one of you for being here. And as we continue in this journey of God's pilgrimage of justice and peace as partners, I pray that we'll be blessed both with the passion that was so generously shared, but also with the compassion that will make a difference in the lives of people across the world. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much. I think we should get an award for how well we keep time. But I also just want to add some thanks also to the rest of the team at the Desmond Tutu Center, Prof. Lee Shanik Udemans, Professor Miranda Pillay, and Mr. Toby Colotti, there we go, who also planned in months, many months for this lecture, and so we're very grateful for their time as well. So colleagues, friends, we've come to the end of our evening. I think all that's left to say is, as we leave the space, may we carry the Archbishop's laughter, his laughter, his courage and his stubborn hope with us, and may we continue to work so that land, justice and joy may belong to all. Please do stay behind and join us for some light refreshments at the back, some more conversation, because as the Arch reminds us, we are made for companionship and for togetherness. Thank you for your time this evening.